Hey guys, welcome back. We're still reading The Exiled Prince. We're up to chapter 10. A mysterious hand writes on the wall. The armies of the Medes and Persians crouched at the gates of Babylon, waiting to pounce. But King Belshazzar was still not afraid. In fact, to show how unafraid he was, he would give the biggest party ever. Hey, let's have a siege party. So he invited 1,000 of his lords, and they would feast together, and they would worship their idols of wood and stone, and thumb their noses at the Medes and Persians outside the gates. Well, meanwhile, Darius the Mede, who had been the very same man as Harpagus, possibly, and Cyrus the Persian, eyed the massive Babylonian walls. Darius, what say you? How shall we enter the city? Darius shook his head. Can't use ladders. The walls are too high. To build mounts would take years. There's not enough wood here. Notice the Euphrates River flows under their walls. Could our soldiers swim under them? Darius shook his head. I think not. Cyrus agreed. When I walked into the city last month disguised as a beggar, those walls must be 50 feet thick. Most of our men couldn't swim that far underwater. If we could only dry up the river, Darius laughed. Perhaps we can, Cyrus said seriously. Dry up the Euphrates? How? Remember the story of Necrosis, queen of Babylon? She wanted to build a bridge across the river in the midst of Babylon. Darius's eyes lighted up. Yes, she made an artificial lake upstream where the marshes are, and blocked the river and sent the water into the lake she had dug. So the Euphrates ceased to flow through Babylon. We can do the same. We will march under the walls of invincible Babylon. Cyrus put a hand on the shoulder of Darius. Let us to the work. The armies set to work. They used their horses to drag to the river huge blocks of stone. They scraped the earth back that banked the river against the marshes, and the water began to trickle into the old, dried-up lake. Slowly, so slowly that no one in Babylon seemed to notice, the level of water flowing through Babylon dropped. If only they had noticed, the guards in Babylon would have locked the gates along the river inside the city walls. The Medes and Persians would still not have gotten into the city. But the guards, like Belshazzar, thought they were perfectly safe inside Babylon's mighty walls. They never troubled themselves to keep awake or man the gates. Belshazzar's party was a huge success. Never had the palace halls echoed with such laughter and singing. Never had the wine flowed more freely. Never had the king been more drunk. He beckoned dizzily to his servant. I'm tired of this wine. I know what will improve the flavor. Bring me the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar brought from the temple in Jerusalem. These vessels were brought. Those holy, beautiful vessels that were designed by God himself to be used to worship him alone. And the Babylonians filled them to the brim with wine. Belshazzar waved his cup, and the liquid slopped over the side and splashed on those around him. Ah, you beautiful thing, he said. You are worthy of my gods. But as he tried to focus his bloodshot eyes on the cup, his glance fell on the wall across the room. A hand, just a hand, nothing more, was writing in large characters on the plaster of the wall beside the lighted candlestick. The king gaped in stunned surprise and squinted as he tried to read the writing. What did it say? He couldn't tell. What ghost had written these horrible, meaningless words? His arms and legs turned to rubber, and he fell back in his seat. His teeth chattered so hard that it was difficult to make words come out. "Call my astrologers," he cried. "Hurry! Tell them whoever can read this writing, I will give him a chain of gold to wear, and clothes of scarlet, and make him third ruler in the kingdom." Well, the wise men hurried to the king's side, and they gawked at the writing, but none of them could read a word. Then Belshazzar was truly terrified. Belshazzar's queen mother heard the awful news. Excuse me. She hurried to the banquet hall. "O king," she said, breathing heavily, "there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. Your father Nebuchadnezzar made him chief wise man. He is called Daniel, or Belteshazzar. He will be able to tell you what this writing means." It had been years since Daniel had been summoned into the king's presence, for Belshazzar did not want to listen to the words of a man who said, "Thus saith the Lord." Nevertheless, Daniel came quickly to the king's side. He slowly read the writing on the wall, and then looked into the king's face. "Come, come, can you read the writing? I'll give you many gifts if you can." "Yes, O king, I can tell you what the writing means, but keep your gifts. I don't want them. You know, O king, that the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar a great kingdom. He was the greatest man in the kingdom, and that kingdom was the greatest in the world. He could do anything his heart desired, but when he lifted up his heart, then God cast him off his throne, and he wandered about like a beast in the fields, until he learned that the Most High God rules the kingdoms of men. God decides who will rule. Now, King Belshazzar, you knew all this, but you have deliberately lifted up your heart against God. You praised gods made with men's hands, gods that can't see or hear. You would not glorify the true God of heaven and earth, the God who holds your breath in his hands. Belshazzar interrupted impatiently. "What does the writing mean?" Daniel read it out loud. "Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin." Mene means that God has ended your reign and your kingdom. Tekel means that God has judged you, and you have been found wanting. Upharsin means that your kingdom is given to the Medes and the Persians. It was hard to tell, looking on, if the message frightened Belshazzar yet more, or if the wine had so drugged his senses that he was unable to be afraid. He did command that the robe be brought, and that a proclamation be made that Daniel should be third ruler in the kingdom. But even as the proclamation was made, and even as the scarlet robe was draped on Daniel's shoulders, and the chain of gold hung around his neck, the armies of the Medes and Persians were wading through the knee-deep waters of the Euphrates, underneath the impregnable walls of Babylon. Silent like ghosts, they overpowered the unsuspecting guards, and swarmed into the city. And that night Belshazzar, the king, who lifted up his heart against God, was slain, and Darius the Mede took the kingdom. That very night came true the prophecy of the hand that had written on the wall. Wow. That will bring us to chapter 11. This story is moving right along, isn't it? We'll have to see what happens next. Daniel's not done yet, I guess.